It's fair to say that Final Fantasy XVI has been doing extremely well sales-wise, and more importantly, it has garnered quite a lot of attention from many different audiences, both PlayStation fanboys who were hoping to have an exclusive to be able to flaunt before the release of Spider-Man later this year, whether it is traditional Final Fantasy fans who have been hoping for a little bit of rekindling of the franchise and something a little bit more, and of course, casual fans who have been always interested in the Final Fantasy franchise but never really decided to jump in because the games maybe were too RPG intricate. And this time around, because Final Fantasy 16 has been rather casual, it has gotten a lot of attention. So at the same time, you also have Square Enix talking a lot about the fact that Final Fantasy can be anything they want it to be. It doesn't necessarily have to be a traditional RPG anymore, or even an action RPG. And it's with that train of thought in mind that Game Ram put up a relatively interesting article from Zachary Grief. Huge shout out to them, link in the description below, where they talk about what if Final Fantasy can take on any form. Would a Monster Hunter style game seem rather obvious? So essentially they are suggesting that because Final Fantasy now can be just about anything, it doesn't necessarily have to be an RPG anymore, but it can be an action RPG. Well, what's more action RPG than Monster Hunter at this point in time? An IP that's gotten so much love, so much attention, specifically from Capcom, as they have grown it into the behemoth that it has become, no pun intended. But at the same time, we also have the clear lineage of Final Fantasy collaborations with Capcom, as they've decided to put some of those monsters, Behemoth included, into previous Monster Hunter games. So in this video, I want to try to do a little bit of a discussion topic regarding what the Game Rant suggests on a Monster Hunter style Final Fantasy game, but also break down what would that even look like realistically speaking, and would it be actually a true Monster Hunter competitor? The article simply mentions that once again a new Final Fantasy has reached players, and many diehard fans will likely have their hands tied with the lengthy adventure that it offers for quite some time. For the last 36 years, Final Fantasy has been an incredible RPG series that's even spanned a franchise within itself in Final Fantasy VII and Chocobo's Mystery Dungeon. These games tackle all kinds of subsections of the genre is based on, from multi-base hack and slash gameplay as seen in Crisis Core Final Fantasy VII Reunion, and many more. The fact that Final Fantasy has gone through so many iterations and reinventions of its formula to where it is broken to expectations for RPG a few times in a long history isn't lost in Square Enix. In fact, Yoshinori Kitase, Square Enix's vice president, has gone on record to say that the company wouldn't have any quarrels with making a Final Fantasy game that played like Call of Duty, which is a hilarious quote, by the way, which would certainly come out on the left field of the franchise, usually about gigantic yellow ostrich-like birds. They're talking about, of course, the chocobos, crystals, and summoning a number of powerful dragons. That said, if a Call of Duty inspired Final Fantasy game is on the table, then perhaps a Final Fantasy Monster Hunter like game should be as well. And the funny thing is, this is not even like a far-fetched idea that they would even mention Call of Duty, because if you take a closer look at what they have been doing with like Final Fantasy VII, just the Final Fantasy VII IP, they've released 2 mobile games that are like third-person shooters, which are, I believe, one of them didn't necessarily do very well. The other one is about to come out or something along those lines, maybe later this year. And they continue to try, man. They're trying to get that mobile money, and they keep doing shooters for whatever reason. So, you know, they don't even have Clouds running around with a sword, but instead it's just a shooter Final Fantasy game. So it's not necessarily too far-fetched what they're suggesting here, but of course, more Monster Hunter is something that many audiences will most likely hopefully try to request. Final Fantasy has made a staple in each number entries that is something different, and what means is that each game is certainly going to do something that the last one would have never tried. For instance, while Final Fantasy 15 and 16 are both action and role-playing games, the way the two of them operate is such very different. Among them, Final Fantasy VII Remake is a primarily action RPG like Final Fantasy 15, but hard ways to slow the game's speed, so it was the game that ran similar to the original Final Fantasy 7 as it could. Final Fantasy 16 is earned its high critical praise in part due to how the developers learned from Final Fantasy 15's shortcomings to make the title that came after it. Recently, many Final Fantasy games have been dancing along the line between realism and fantasy as they were a tightrope, dipping into jumping just about whatever suits the story and gameplay in most and specific moments. This is something that the iconic monster-based Capcom franchise does quite well too, as Monster Hunter features realistic yet fantastical creatures, encouraging players to catch them with large, almost comedic weapons with the real weight and stamina put to how long it takes to hunt them down. Final Fantasy has its own rather large bestiary of creatures and monsters that would serve a game like this rather well, and this is extremely true. There will likely be need to be some magical elements to counteract just how many of these beasts of magics have their own, such as the many Bahamut's, but it can excite a few Final Fantasy fans to think that they could take down one of these dragons and maybe even a few other iconic Final Fantasy summons with more practical methods than other games. Of course, there would need to be a number of Final Fantasy elements thrown into the balance out of the gameplay to help developers make a true monster hunting Final Fantasy game. One of the biggest things that would set the game apart would be a party-assisted play to the player like other players in co-op Monster Hunter games would. This would make a total task of learning and strategizing for beast players and trying to catch them much easier, and making sure that the game has a strong party of characters that would help the story in the hypothetical Final Fantasy game prosper. Overall, there's plenty of potential in the idea of a Square Enix were they to pursue it. And I completely agree. And we could start off talking about the fact that, like they mentioned in the article, the bestiary for Final Fantasy is massive. One of the things that you see them do quite a lot is bring characters and monsters along from previous titles into the newest releases. So now, do you only have monsters that have kind of permutated their way from like the original pixel art games all the way to now the 3D bombastic action set pieces that you see nowadays, but of course they have lore tied to them. So, you know, in a previous game you have been able to have, for example, bombs become friendly with some players in like the Final Fantasy world, for example, where they essentially become assists to the player. But then you have, in traditional Final Fantasy games fashion, they are just straight up, they're treated like almost boss-like creatures, except in certain instances. So it's one of those situations where some monsters will easily have a recognizable facet to them. You know, can you imagine them trying to let you hunt a chocobo for parts? You can go ahead and make a chocobo armor, for example, a feathered weapon. Think of it Kulu Yaku style, right? It's the same idea. Nothing necessarily too out of the ordinary, where Capcom has already had that done. Not only do they have the bestiary to tie it with it, but of course they already have classes on top of that. So you don't necessarily need to have a weapon specifically for a blank character, but maybe the weapon can actually dictate the class that you play. So you have maces, which are usually, you know, some caster type weapon that are just staff related for you to be able to cast spells and boost your powers. You have lances, which will make you a dragoon. You have your sword and shield will make you standard warriors. I mean, just think about the opportunities. Final Fantasy XIV did that extremely well. Time specific weapons to specific classes, and at the end of the day you were just pretty much defined by the weapon that you were used, not necessarily because the weapon defined the class, but they were like synonymous with that class. And then of course you have the storytelling aspects of it, and that's probably the more interesting thing. Sure, you would expect them to try to copy and paste the gameplay a little bit and try to do what Capcom already does, maybe even Wild Hearts to some degree, since it was somewhat successful to some degree. But at the same time, can you imagine the level of cutscenes, the level of storytelling that it could potentially have, something akin to what we are seeing with Final Fantasy 16? I am playing this game throughout right now, and I'm just amazed at what they are able to do with cutscenes, the way that they look. I'm not gonna get into like, you know, resolution and the graphics and all of that, but just the real-time cutscenes that they were able to render look stunning. They look like CGI movies, for example, that, you know, 5 to 10 years ago you knew it was a direct cutscene. Final Fantasy 16 certainly has, you know, pre-rendered cutscenes, but try to tell them apart from actually in-game render cutscenes in real time, it's an extremely high difficult job. I think the bitrate and movement can tell apart because they're like, they move a little bit different. They're a little bit more I want to say more fluid when you are seeing the CGI pre-rendered cutscenes from indifferent from an in-game cutscene. But man, it just looks so fantastically good, and bringing that same notion into effect for your Monster Hunter like Final Fantasy game, it's just, you know, those monster introduction cut sequences that you would be able to see would just be stunning. And I think Capcom will have a real winner in their hands if they actually try to do that. But again, at the same time, it is just food for thought. Definitely let me know in the comments what you guys think regarding a potential Final Fantasy Monster Hunter like game with the amazing lore that's been tied to it in the past. If you're brand new to my channel, though, be sure to leave a like and subscribe. Hit the bell to receive notifications when the videos go up. And as always, thank you so much for watching. See ya.